welcome everyone for coming back early for lunch. Thank you very much for that. A few years ago, I got lost in the Bronx. And the Bronx, especially the South Bronx, are you from the Bronx? Oh, fantastic. You love this story. So, the South Bronx is the poorest congressional district in the United States. And the reason I was there was because I was going to do a user interview, but I couldn't find the address. So we walked for what seems like miles and miles and miles past buildings like this one. And there didn't seem to be any shops or cafes in this area of the Bronx. There would be a cluster of fast food joints around a subway station, but that was about it. And there was a shocking number of people actually in the street in wheelchairs or walking with sticks. And one old lady hailed me from a third-floor window because I think she thought I was a social worker, because the only white people you see in this area of the Bronx are social workers. So we were using Google Maps, and we were trying to find this address. And the further we walked, the further away from us it moved, until eventually a taxi dispatcher told us that the address didn't exist. So we came from the tech world, and when the technology failed us, we really didn't know what to do. But technology fails low-income Americans every day by not addressing their problems. If you go to downtown San Francisco, which is literally the heart of the tech business, you will see thousands of well-paid tech workers walking past thousands of homeless people in order to get to work every day. And in a similar fashion, technology has ignored people who are on low incomes, even though this is like 40 to 50 million people in the United States. And I think a large part of the reason for that is because they simply know nothing about them. So at least in the US, if you work in technology, you tend to be well-educated and well-paid, and you have little to no social interaction with people who are on a low income. So a few years ago in Brooklyn, 3 people decided to do something about this, and they founded a thing called Blue Ridge Labs at Robin Hood. So the Robin Hood Foundation is the biggest poverty-fighting organization in New York City. And Blue Ridge Labs was a new initiative within Robin Hood which wanted to make tech products for households in America that earn less than $25,000 a year. And that's for a family of 4 people. They also wanted to educate the wider tech community about the problems that people on low income face. So they created a fellowship, a 3-month fellowship, and they selected 6 people. And each of those people were going to work with a designer and a developer in order to create a product. And I was one of those fellows in the first year. I always thought of New York as a rich city because it is the capital of the richest and the most powerful nation in the world. But in fact, 1 in 5 New Yorkers live in poverty. Almost 2 million people in New York receive food stamps. And there are more than 1 million working New Yorkers who earn less than $20,000 a year. So the Blue Ridge Fellows, including myself, we came from the tech world, right? So we had worked at startups, we had worked at large tech companies like Facebook, we knew something about building products, but we didn't know anything about living on a low income in New York City. So the first thing that Blue Ridge did was they set up a load of user interviews for us, and we went and talked to a huge range of low-income New Yorkers. And as you can imagine, in a city as diverse as New York, they were a hugely diverse group as well. So I talked to immigrants from Ecuador, from Mexico, from the Caribbean, from Eastern Europe, but I also talked to native New Yorkers who were of all ages and all stages of life. So I talked to a 21-year-old dad in Washington Heights. I talked to a retirement age school aide in Brownsville and Brooklyn. But one thread that emerged from all of these interviews was that inequality is not just about income. Scarcity of money leads to other forms of scarcity, whether that's of opportunity, of education, of information, of social capital, of time, of health, of security, and even of sleep. So when people lack any resource which they really need, research has shown that that saps both your brain power and your willpower. And it limits your ability to make long-term plans because you're so focused on the thing that you really need right now. So that puts further obstacles in the way of people who are trying to change their situation. The other thing we learned pretty quickly is that there isn't always a technical solution. In fact, there often isn't a technical solution. So poverty is a complex, intractable human problem, and it needs to be tackled in many different ways. And there wasn't, what we could do with a tech product in 3 months was going to be limited. But what we realized we maybe could do was we could increase our potential users' stock of one of those resources that I listed on the previous screen. So we could maybe give people a little bit more time, a little bit more security, whatever it was, because that would help them. So one of my colleagues, Jimmy Chen, went down to the food stamp office in Brooklyn, and he watched people apply for food stamps. So it's a scene something like this, except people are inside, because people queue for 4 to 5 hours to do the application. And every single person in that queue was on their mobile phone. But you could not apply for food stamps on a mobile phone in New York City. So what he did was, he and his team, they created a very simple mobile app where you could fill in the minimum information that was required for the first stage of the application, and then they would generate the full application, and they would fax it to the food stamp office because they still accepted faxes. And that means you're saving someone half a day. And when you are on a low income and you're maybe doing an hourly job, that means you don't get paid for that time. So it's probably a whole day you're not getting paid. It's maybe half a day where you either have to pay someone or you have to call in a favor to take care of your kids whilst you're applying for food stamps. So just saving people that half day can make a big difference. So here are a few examples of some of the projects for the first year, and there's been many more since then. So the first one is Fresh EBT, which I just spoke about, and that has now changed from helping people apply for food stamps to helping them manage their food stamp budget and to stretch it further by getting special offers from retailers. The middle one is Yenko. So this was to help low-income college students by alerting them when they were in danger of losing their financial aid and giving them advice on what they needed to do in order to retain it. And the third project is my own one. That was Neat Streak. So this was a little mobile tool for house cleaners. And the idea was clients would pick from a cleaning menu, and you tick off what you want done in each room and how you want it done. And then the cleaner, when they were doing the job, they would tick things off and then send that to the client. And it was bilingual, so it automatically translated everything from English to Spanish, right? So this seems super simple. But the idea was that you stopped people from losing jobs because of misunderstandings between cleaners and their clients. A few years before I did Blue Ridge, I interviewed an impact investor in Mexico. And he said, one of the things you have to be very clear about when you get into social entrepreneurship is, do you want to do good or do you want to feel good? Because this is business, and business is messy, and you're going to have to make hard decisions. And if you only care about feeling good, you're not going to make those hard decisions. So I can tell you I often didn't feel good during this 3 months of my life. I often didn't know what I was doing. You had all of the normal problems of starting a new enterprise, a new project. I had to make difficult decisions with limited information. You're trying to form a team in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. And all of us had given up jobs to come and do this. And many of us had left our homes as well. So it was really difficult at times. And this is why the founders of Blue Ridge Labs, when they're selecting people to come into this program, they don't just look for skills. They look for people who are comfortable with being really uncomfortable, because you will be really uncomfortable, at least some of the time. The other reason that you won't feel good is because your users will not trust you. So people on low income in America are often targeted by scams, which offer them fake educational qualifications or applications for government benefits. So they have good reasons to be suspicious of anything that seems too good to be true. To give you an example, we did a user testing session with a group of Spanish-speaking cleaners, and everybody was being paid for their time. But halfway through the session, one of the participants stood up and started telling the others in Spanish that we were, a company that was exploiting them and all this kind of stuff. And this would happen quite often. So the lesson to take from this is that you have to work harder to earn your users' trust than you maybe would with a product for another population. And you have to prove the product's value to them more than you would maybe in other cases. Another Silicon Valley mantra is that you should move fast and break things. Again, this does not work with a low-income population. Number one, because you have to earn their trust. Number two, because you cannot leave people with subpar social outcomes because you release some kind of crappy, half-baked app. So Good Call, which is another Blue Ridge project, is a very good example of this. It's a free legal hotline which people can call if they've been arrested in the Bronx. And if you're arrested in New York, kind of like the films, you get one phone call, and if you don't get through to the right person or you don't get through to somebody who can help you, then you can end up in jail for weeks. And sometimes people confess to crimes they actually didn't commit just to get out of prison. So Good Call cannot afford to let its users down. So they spent a year making sure the process was bulletproof, making sure they had all of the right partnerships with legal firms before the first user got access to this. Another Silicon Valley mantra is that you should disrupt or replace existing systems. Again, if you're working with a low-income population, quite often you must work with legacy systems, whether that's government programs or whether it is nonprofits or community organizations who are already trusted by the population that you want to serve, because that is going to help you with the trust problem. So for example, I worked with the Domestic Workers Alliance, and they actually inspired my project, and they helped me a lot along the way. You won't fit the funding patterns. So when you're trying to raise money for any kind of new project, new company, that's always going to be difficult. But when you're a social entrepreneur serving a low-income population, there's even more problems. There's a huge funding gap. So to give you an example, this is my friend Margot, who was another one of the Blue Ridge Fellows. And her company, as I mentioned before, is Yenko. So it helps low-income community college students stop dropping out of college by alerting them early when they're going to lose their financial aid. Because if they lose their financial aid, they drop out, and then often they end up with debt, and they end up with no degree. So the first place that somebody like Margot could go for funding is venture capital. There was some research from Village Capital a couple of years ago which showed that the lion's share of venture capital funding goes to attractive white males who went to top-tier colleges in Boston or San Francisco. And as you can see, Margot is not an attractive white male. However, she does have an MBA from Stanford, but she doesn't fit the profile. The other problem that you're going to have in raising money from VCs is comparables. So investors look at similar companies in your industry who are at a similar stage in order to figure out if your metrics look good or not. But there are no similar companies in this case. There are no companies doing what Margot is doing. So it's very difficult for her to raise from VC funding. The second place you can go is philanthropic funds. They will give grants, generally to nonprofits, but they are not really set up to deal with an early stage, risky social enterprise because they have to answer to their donors for every single dollar that they spend. The final place you can go is impact investment funds, and they are actually set up to deal with social entrepreneurs, but they generally give money to later stage projects. So there's a huge funding gap. Another issue you're going to have is that you are not solving your own problems. So the way that Blue Ridge tackled this was they introduced an expert track. So each team doesn't just have a product manager, a developer, and a designer. It also has an expert, which is someone who is living with the problem that you're trying to solve, or somebody who has worked with that problem for many years. So they have deep domain knowledge, because understanding a problem is not the same as living with a problem. So Eileen, who you see up here on the screen here, was 71 when she was a Blue Ridge expert. And in that year, Blue Ridge concentrated on building products for older low-income Americans. But really, what you want is product managers, designers, developers from low-income communities deciding which problems they want to tackle and how they want their communities to change. But because of all of the previous issues I listed, the lack of access to good education and to opportunity, those people are not getting into the tech pipeline. And that's a big unsolved problem, which is going to take time and investment to solve. So because of all of this depressing stuff that I've been telling you about for the last 10 minutes, if you try and build a product for low-income Americans, you will probably fail. So I failed at this. So I did my 3 months. I had a good prototype at the end. It was a good potential product, but my team was not functioning. And I decided I didn't want to stay in New York. So I handed it over to the Domestic Workers Alliance, and they did some further work with it. But basically, I failed, right? Because I didn't bring any benefits to the users that I wanted to serve. Probably the most useful thing I did was I actually wrote about this. So I wrote about the experience as a way of sort of educating other people about the issues involved. But it's still worth trying. And I'll tell you why. So even though I failed, other people didn't. So Jimmy, who I told you about at the beginning, his company is Fresh EBT. And after the 3 months in Blue Ridge, he bounced around from accelerator to accelerator, like trying to keep going for another 3 months, another 6 months, trying to get enough money together. He lost both of his co-founders. Like, he struggled to raise money for all of the reasons that I outlined before. And this went on for about 4 years, right? And he kept going. And then last year, he raised $4 million from Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the top Silicon Valley venture capital funds, and the Omidyar Network, which is probably the top impact investment fund in the world, so like dream team of investors. And what he told me was, he said, for years, the fact that I was serving an unusual population of people on low income worked against me. And then suddenly, it started to work for me, because people suddenly seemed to see the point of this, and the fact that there are 40 to 50 million people in the US on low income. More importantly, Fresh EBT now serves 1 million people who are receiving food stamps in the US and is helping them to stretch their food stamp budget. And this is 1 million people who are struggling in an unequal and grossly unfair society. So Fresh EBT is giving them a little bit more, and literally this could be a little bit more food on the table. With some of the other projects, it could be a little bit more security, a little bit more opportunity, a little bit more education. Because when you don't have much, a little bit really makes a difference. And that's why this is still worth trying. And I really hope that some of you in the audience, some of you optimistic young people, will try and do something like this and succeed where I failed. Thank you very much.